Hi, it's Dwyer. GamblersAdvisory.com, a free site. BettingAngle.us, a free site. I've been in lockdown in California so long, I'm not even sure what today's date is. We'll call it May the 28th, 2020. Let's talk boxing, but first remember, the opinion you should follow should be your own. Just consider this video to be a second opinion from a complete stranger online. Now, how we carry ourselves leads people to draw conclusions, right? Joe Louis, my dad's favorite fighter, came across as very urbane, right? Very polished, always said the right things in public, right? Served in the military, helped people in the military, people like Jackie Robinson, who got in trouble, and yes, I mean that Jackie Robinson. Also Sugar Ray Robinson. Look up his history with the military. But, you know, Joe also was a guy who had been around a bit. The secret to Joe Louis was his trainer, Jack Blackburn, right? A guy who had already been convicted of manslaughter and who had spent 4 years in prison before he became Joe Louis's trainer, right? Blackburn, for those who don't know, is in the Hall of Fame, right? Understand, too, one of Joe's managers was a numbers runner. Ended up serving time in prison. In other words, the clean-cut Joe Louis image was an image. Right later in life, one of Joe's best friends, I mean best friends, was a guy who looked up to him, named Sonny Liston. Right now, Leo Santa Cruz carries himself in a very regal manner. If you walked into a room and you saw a bunch of people, and Leo Santa Cruz was in the room, and they said, "Hey, tell us who in this room has been a boxing champion," right? In my opinion, Leo Santa Cruz would be one of the guys you pick because he carries himself like a guy who's been successful, right? Santa Cruz, to me, is a real polished guy. You watch him in interviews, you understand that this is a guy who can be soft-spoken, because the guy's game is that aggressive, right? He's getting by on volume and stamina. He's not a guy to run from you, even though at 5'7.5", he's tall for his weight class. He's not a guy to run from you. He gives away his height. He leans forward. He's prepared to throw more than you in the pocket, right? And he's a warrior who is willing to go the distance. I believe his last 3 fights have all gone the distance, right? Let's shift gears. You know, when I was a young guy, I loved being a young guy, right? I loved being part of my generation. Whatever was going on with my age group, hey, I loved being a part of it. Right? Music, culture, clothes. I didn't want to hang around with people over 30 years old. I didn't want to hang around people who had real jobs. I was a high school student. I was a college student. Right? I was a student. People talking about a mortgage and a car payment. Whoa, 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 whoa. That's too much, player. Hey, man, I'm a young guy who enjoys being a young guy, right? I'm not running away from irresponsibility, right? You know, I'm at that age where I still have plausible deniability, where I could make bad mistakes and say, hey, you know what? I was just inexperienced, and people will give me a mulligan. Well, that's Gervonta Davis, right? When you see Gervonta Davis, you feel like you're watching an episode of The Wire, don't you? Davis dresses like a young guy. Davis talks like a young guy. He's not trying to throw on that suit jacket like Michael Jordan did and speak the King's English and look like he's connecting with older people. Davis isn't trying to connect with older people at all, right? He wants you to see him as a guy who is young, right? Hasn't bought into the rules that adults have to follow. He's in his own world. What I want people to realize is that's a persona, right? That's like Joe Louis, one of boxing's best trash talkers in history, looking, a certain way, coming across a certain way, coming across as respectful, making sure he didn't look like Jack Johnson. Right? Well, this is Gervonta Davis making sure he doesn't look like Joe Louis. Right? He wants to look a little bit edgy. Right? He wants people to understand, hey man, I'm from the streets. I haven't left. He doesn't want to be the black guy who's successful, who's in his 30s, or who's in his mid-20s and has already left the hood. Right? What I want people to do is to look at Gervonta Davis's background. You're going to find out that he had over 200 amateur fights. Only one of these guys has the extensive amateur pedigree. It's Gervonta Davis. Davis won 205 of 220 amateur fights. He's a 3-time Silver Gloves champion. This is a decorated amateur who is also one of the hardest punchers in the entire sport of boxing. Let's go back a few years before Trump. Let's go back to January the 1st, 2015. Date I'm just picking randomly. Right? During a 14-fight stretch, from that date till now, right, a 14-fight stretch, his last 14 fights, in which he has fought unbeaten Jose Pedraza, unbeaten Liam Walsh, unbeaten Francisco Fonseca, and longtime tough guy Yorkis Gamboa. Davis has won all 14 fights by stoppage. Folks, he's fighting unbeaten fighters. He was the underdog against Jose Pedraza. He's fighting unbeaten fighters. His record going back to January the 1st, 2015, is on par with that, in my opinion, of almost anyone in boxing. The fact that he's doing it all by KO shows you how dominant he is, how almost impossible it is to be in the ring with him for 12 rounds and not hit the canvas at least once. Understand, even the Gamboa fight, and I know that makes him to the 12th round, has Gamboa down in the 2nd round. Gamboa hits the canvas multiple times in that fight. Right? So, we're hearing about Leo Santa Cruz against Gervonta Davis, and I'll agree. Davis is a guy who has problems making weight. Right? But let me just say this. He's fighting Liam Walsh across the Atlantic. He leaves the country for the fight. At the beginning of that fight, there were a couple people there rooting for Davis, right? His promoter, Floyd Mayweather, maybe his trainer, right? There were a couple people rooting for Davis. It didn't seem like there were much more than that. Liam Walsh had the crowd on his side. Davis is in a foreign country, right? Davis has already been there. And let's just say Davis drowns out the crowd, takes them out of the fight, then takes out his opponent. I believe Davis, for all the, I'm from the hood and, I'm young and stuff like that, for all the persona, understand Davis is mentally tough and he's actually an older soul, right? As great as his unbeaten professional record is, understand this guy has been a dominant fighter since his early amateur days. Let's go back to Leo Santa Cruz. Let's face it. Whether it's you, me, Leo Santa Cruz, Gervonta Davis, or Michael Jordan, who I mentioned earlier, we're all in the same business, aren't we? The check cashing business. If you go to work, it's to get paid, right? Whatever you do, I meet people and they say, hey, I'm the executive assistant to the senior vice president. But look, that's all fine. At the end of the day, we both want that paycheck. In boxing, if you don't want the paycheck, then you can stay an amateur. These guys are professionals. They're risking getting concussions every fight for the payday and the legacy. So when you're in a career position, like Leo Santa Cruz was against Carl Frampton, where your first two fights are classics, where the third fight, the rubber fight, would get you a huge payday, as well as legacy, right? These rubber fights, we remember Bo Holyfield 3, don't we? We remember the Thriller in Manila, don't we? These rubber fights where, the first fight goes one way, the second fight goes the other way, and look at the scoring in the second Santa Cruz Frampton fight. That third fight, all they'd have to do is announce it. They were going to have at least 10,000 fans. All they had to do was announce it. Media outlets would have been competing to show it if one didn't have exclusive rights. Now, to me, it says a lot that Santa Cruz, who lost the first fight to crisp counterpunching Carl Frampton, that's who Frampton is. He's a crisp counterpuncher, right? To me, Santa Cruz, who squeaks out the second fight on volume, stamina, and some mistakes Frampton makes. To me, Santa Cruz didn't want the third fight. Understand, we're seeing with Canelo and Golovkin how fighters could be angling for the third fight, but real life jumps in all of a sudden. Right? Golovkin signs with the new network, moves away from his trainer Abel Sanchez. Canelo's jumping to different weight classes, right? He fought Golovkin at middleweight. Oh, here he is at 168 fighting for a belt. Oh, here he is at 175 fighting for a belt. We understand that life happens and that sometimes fighters who are fighting or who are in the game are dealing with the financial situation outside the ring, or they're dealing with other challenges from other fighters in other weight classes, or maybe their own weight class. We get that. But what's interesting with the Frampton-Santa Cruz situation is Frampton repeatedly says, hey, I want to fight Santa Cruz a third fight. Right? Santa Cruz doesn't respond. Understand, too, this is boxing. Guys who don't want to fight you will talk crap about you to get their names in the paper. But then they won't follow through with the fight. Right? How long did that Bernard Hopkins-Roy Jones rematch take to get made? Over a decade? Right? But yet, Bernard led you to believe that he was ready to sign for Roy. Right? He was ready to sign until they actually started talking contracts. Right? Well, let me just say this. I believe, and I know, I know I'll get grief, right? I keep getting grief about the Wilder Anthony Joshua situation, right? I'm just going to go with my own take based on what I've read, based on what I've observed. I'm a boxing fan like anyone else. I have opinions. I believe that Carl Frampton would hop in the ring tomorrow if that fight were made. I think the person who is hesitant for the third fight against Carl Frampton is Leo Santa Cruz. Because I think Frampton's style, sharpshooting counterpuncher, a guy who will concede volume, who will focus on accuracy, gives Leo Santa Cruz problems. Right? Well, let me just say, the devil in this fight is in the details. Santa Cruz's last fight was at 130 pounds. Folks, that's the only time he's fought at 130 pounds. Gervonta Davis became Gervonta Davis at 130 pounds. But his last fight, the one against Gamboa, was at 135 pounds. Now, given that Davis has a problem making weight, right, in my opinion, and given Santa Cruz's complete lack of experience at 135 pounds, if a Gervonta Davis-Leo Santa Cruz fight is announced for 135 pounds, Davis is the clear play. Right? Davis is the person I would leap at for a Santa Cruz-Davis fight at 135. When they announce the fight, you're going to have to stick around the announcement. Let's say you're watching ESPN or some sportscast. You know, you're going to have to stick around to hear the details. It's like, okay, they're fighting. What's the weight? If they say 135, you're good to go. I think Davis has the upper hand either way you slice the cake. Davis by KO, that's probably the most likely outcome. As the last 14 guys he's faced, no. Right? Understand, that's what Davis has done since January the 1st, 2015. Right? Santa Cruz, no experience at 135. He's fighting a guy who dropped Yorkis Gamboa several times in their last fight. He's fighting one of boxing's dominant punchers. Let me also say, too, Davis southpaw. You start getting cuffed around by a guy, somewhere in the fight, Santa Cruz is going to forget Davis is a southpaw. That's what happens when you're semi-conscious. If you leave Davis's left hand open, good night, Irene. It's a little bit dodgier at 130. Again, you're going to have to stick around the announcement. They announce the fight, you're going to be there with a pad going, what's the weight? What's the weight? Right? At 130, Davis is going to have problems making weight. There's a reason why his last fight was at 135. There's a reason why Davis has had problems making weight in the past. When you see a guy with a lot of fights at a certain weight, and the guy's in his mid-20s, guess what? Guys in their mid-20s grow up. They gain weight. At 130, it's problematical. If the fight is at 130, I'll take Davis to win. I'll hedge it with the over. The logic being, if the fight goes longer, then Santa Cruz has a shot at beating Davis on volume, stamina, fitness. If the fight ends early by stoppage, I'm sorry, I'm not going with the guy whose last 3 fights have gone the distance. No, I'm going with the guy whose last 14 fights have not. So at 135, this is a mismatch. I like Gervonta Davis. I'll even leave the play unhedged. Maybe I'll sprinkle some on Davis by stoppage. Right? The public is going to see Santa Cruz and they're going to think, oh, Santa Cruz has a great chin. You know what? Guys have a great chin until they face great punchers. Right? As good a puncher as Carl Frampton is, Frampton's smaller than Gervonta Davis. At 135, my play is simply Davis to win. Maybe I'll sprinkle some on Davis by KO, just to juice the play. Right? But it's Davis to win. At 130, I'll take Davis to win, but I will hedge to 130 with the over. This way, if the fight goes the distance, I'll sit there and think to myself, I'll be doggone. Right? If Davis wins the decision, because if it's one of those distance fights where Santa Cruz hits the canvas multiple times like Gamboa did, right? Gamboa makes it to the later rounds, doesn't make it to the end of the fight. If it's one of those fights, then I could see Davis winning a decision. If it's by stoppage, it's Davis all day. Right? But there is a scenario where Davis is weight drained, struggling to make 130. Then in the later rounds, he looks like Andy Ruiz did in the rematch against AJ. Right? So don't be fooled by Davis looking like he just walked out a building in Dwyer. Don't be fooled by Davis loving his youth and wanting to come across as a 25-year-old guy. This is a guy with an extensive amateur pedigree. Extensive. Right? Literally, more than 200 fights with only 15 losses as an amateur. Right? This is an extensive amateur pedigree, a very successful fighter who has not had to go the distance during the last 5 years, even though he's fighting world-class opposition. Right? Davis at 135 to win. At 130, Davis to win, hedged with the over. That's how I see it. Let me hear from you. I hope you leave your comments in the comment section of this video. In fact, let me go one step further. If you want to juice the odds at 130, then take Davis by KO, hedged with the over. Right? If he wins by decision, you don't get the KO juice, but at the same time, that play would be hedged. That's how I see it. And of course, if Santa Cruz wins by decision at 130, you're covered with the over. That's how I see it. Let me hear from you. I hope you leave your comments in the comment section of this video. Thanks for stopping by.